everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Matt Johnson of Johns Hopkins. One of the more famous folks we've had on the show in a while, and really excited. Kyle and I had the opportunity to interview Matt maybe just a week or two ago, and it was great. Really fun time. Got into all sorts of interesting things here, and I think you're going to like it. Certainly one of the more fun podcasts for me to do, and thank you to Matt for making the time. Wildly busy researcher, and just very thankful that Matt was willing to spend the time with us. And we get into all sorts of stuff from consciousness to his recent article about introducing kind of strange or unfamiliar metaphysical concepts to people, and priming, the idea of priming an individual before an experience, and just leaving your baggage out of it, leaving your kind of programming at home. And what does that mean? What does it mean when you kind of just set a nice container, don't introduce too much, and it works just fine? In fact, amazingly better than most things. So a lot of food for thought there. And I think we should all consider it carefully with what we do. We got the chance to discuss Matt's paper in one of our recent Navigating Psychedelics courses, and it was a really great discussion the students all had there. And just thankful that Matt joined us, and I hope you all enjoy it. What else? Yeah, we still have seats available for Navigating Psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. This is on Thursday nights starting in March. So check that out if you want to get educated on psychedelics. And it's kind of an 8-week deep dive into the psychedelic topic. And, we speak at the level of clinicians, and we address a lot of clinical concerns that folks have. And I think it's one of the better foundations courses you can take on this topic, especially because we have so much pre-recorded material, and you check that out on your own, and then you come to class to discuss it. It's a great way to network with folks around the world. I think we even had students from Bahrain in the Middle East. I think we've had students in Australia, New Zealand, Finland, Norway, Israel. I think we had somebody in Lebanon, which is really cool. Yeah, folks from all over the world are joining, and it is so cool to get perspectives from all over the world. I think last round we even had some folks from Russia, which was neat. So anyway, I think that's it for now, and enjoy this episode with Matt Johnson from Johns Hopkins. It's really fun, and just really grateful that Matt joined us. So see you on the other side. All right. Welcome back, everybody, to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we are honored to have Dr. Matthew Johnson. Welcome to the show. I don't know if you really need an intro. I'm sure our listeners probably know who you are, but do you want to, I guess, just a little brief intro on who you are?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, guys. So I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. I've been doing work with psychedelics ever since my postdoctoral fellowship started in 2004. So about 17 years now, and I've kind of and also study a whole lot of other drugs, everything from meth, cocaine, cannabis, alcohol, caffeine, you name it, uppers, downers, all arounders, and done a lot of stuff with psychedelics, so-called healthy normals, or, just understanding the basic effects in people without problems, but also a number of therapeutic studies, helping people with cancer, with distress, helping cigarette smokers who are addicted to quit smoking, and recently some work treating depression, and have several sort of ongoing or upcoming also therapeutic studies. So a little bit of everything in the human clinical psychedelic space.
Awesome. Thank you. I was just thinking last night, I was kind of going back in my memory bank. And I think the first time I ever met you, and you probably don't remember this because, when you meet people at conferences, I don't know, I don't always remember, but we ended up in an elevator together at the MAPS conference in Oakland, 2013. I think you were there and Bill Richards were there. I was just thinking about that. It was kind of funny. I'm like, oh yeah, I think I met Matt in 2013 in an elevator.
I think I remember that. That's wow. Okay, because I'm picture. I remember that hotel. And that's the 13, not 10.
Yeah.
I think the first one was 10. Yeah. 10 was in sort of like an outdoor campus type area. Yeah.
Funny.
Good memory.
So you recently released a paper called Consciousness, Religion, Gurus, Pitfalls of Psychedelic Medicine. And I thought you were highlighting some really interesting topics there and really important topics. And the first part that you started off with was kind of questioning, what do we mean by consciousness? And it seems like this term does get tossed around pretty often within, psychology, the realm of psychology and spiritual communities. But I thought it was really great that you even raised this point. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about consciousness? And specifically when it comes to psychedelics, we talk about like expansion of consciousness. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. And why you kind of raise this point about consciousness and what is it and definitions around the term.
Sure, my pleasure. And the paper was basically an opportunity to get some stuff off my chest that I've wanted to kind of get out there for a while. And it was really important for me to just, single author it just to make sure, hey, if anything sounds wacky or someone disagrees, it's all on me. There's no I'm getting into areas where with really subtle differences of opinion can be out there. So I wanted to 100% own things and just, anything you read, it's not a result of compromise or whatnot. It's what I think. So yeah, this whole thing with consciousness and like a lot of the topics I covered in that viewpoint paper, it's kind of easy to mischaracterize my stance on it. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be studying consciousness and consciousness isn't interesting. In fact, I'd say quite the opposite. We should be studying these things labeled as consciousness. But the term, the way it's currently used is virtually meaningless because it's used in so many different ways. And in the philosophy of science, you could call this what's known as a jingle fallacy, meaning that when one term is used to refer to truly different things, it causes all kinds of problems. And when in the course of science, and there's a similar concept called the jangle fallacy, where you have different words to describe the same thing, but this is the jingle fallacy. But consciousness is used to refer to different things. I'm not the first person to say this, but let's see, it certainly is not being or has not received much emphasis in the psychedelic when it comes to in the psychedelic science world, where the term is used quite a bit and it's thrown around. And even in studies of so-called consciousness, not everyone, it's in my reading, it's routinely ignored, sort of this precision of what construct or phenomenon are we referring to? And I think, and we have to some of the concepts that I think are underneath the hood when we talk about consciousness are those terms come from philosophy and some come from psychology, but kind of the biggie is phenomenal consciousness. And when people are referring to phenomenal, when they're talking about this, I'd rather they use that term so we know what they're talking about. So this is the biggie, as I said. This is experience itself.
So real quick, consciousness of phenomenon. So like really backing up just to that last point real quick. So phenomenal consciousness being awareness of objects around you in space or sensory input, things like that.
I would just stop at awareness.
Okay.
So even if there's no, regardless of what's in the sensorium, just that there is experience. I mean, so people have described it in different ways. It was Nagel who used the phrase of, what is it like to be something? So what is it like to be a bat? Presumably it's like something to be a bat. That's probably a good example because bats are, they use sonar and they're like really different but they're still animals. And, I think a lot of us assume that other animals like humans are conscious, but it's really the phenomenal consciousness is what the so-called hard problem is about. And so that the whole concept of it being a hard problem wasn't new, but it was David Chalmers that used that for that term, hard problem in 95 to describe this. And I think it's a really great way to think about it. And that's the way I think about it is like, these are questions that right now seem like they're just outside of empirical science. Why does experience exist? And relatedly, how does it exist? I mean, you could even say, does it exist? I mean, in terms of does it exist, it's like most of us are willing to say, yeah, we've got a good inclination because it's for each of us, N of one. Like to me, it totally seems like I exist,
right.
Like there is an experience. Now, you could assume that the rest of the world, like I'm the only entity that truly has had an experience, and that everything else I'm seeing, these are just, the other people and other animals are, there's no inside to them. There's no experience to it. I think that, most of us get, we go past that, and it doesn't pass Occam's razor to assume that that's true. It's like, wow, these other things seem like me and they're like me in all these other ways. I bet there's an experience inside there too. So, we go that far, but we don't even have proof at that level. That's just a really good gut assumption. And philosophically, it's sort of, like I said, it passes Occam's razor. Like it wouldn't be very parsimonious to assume that I'm the only entity or thing that, is having this type of experience, when all the evidence suggests I'm on a planet with like 8 billion other entities like me, and then a bunch of other entities that aren't that different, getting into, non-human animals. So, but nonetheless, that's still only intuition and just some basic, our kind of gut reaction about what's parsimonious. And so we don't even have any proof beyond ourselves that anybody else, anything else is having an experience. And so I kind of think about it this way. If you build a robot or a computer program, and you keep increasing the complexity, and it has, we get past the current levels of artificial intelligence, and it really is starting to have human-like intelligence and what, like, is there a point at which there is an inside looking out? I mean, you can have presumably a completely complex, an entity, a thing that is exuding this complex verbal behavior. It talks like it has feelings. It talks like it has intentions. It acts as an agent in the world seemingly, but it's at least plausible, and it's easier for us to imagine this when we're not talking about biological systems, but when we're talking about mechanical, systems. It's easiest for us to imagine that, and we don't really know, but that robot or that computer program, there's not an experience there, that it's not, and that's what we really mean by phenomenal consciousness. And again, we don't know that there's not an experience there to that computer program or to that robot. But whatever that is, this question about, is there an experience? That's the hard problem. That's that level of experience is phenomenal consciousness. And sort of, I think if this is like everything else is sort of if phenomenal, consciousness is present, then we can think of all the other phenomena that are called consciousness as a sort of type of processing of phenomenal consciousness, like having a sense of self. So now the agent is acting like they are an entity and are talking about self-reflection. So, that, and then sort of like phenomena associated with consciousness. So one of them is access consciousness, the whole idea that 5 seconds ago, I wasn't thinking about my grandmother, but now I am, because I thought, like, what example can I give? So I just mentioned right now I'm thinking of so I wasn't, even if it's in my memory, I wasn't aware of it at one moment, but then somehow it was called forth and I'm aware of it at another moment. So that's that's referring to access. That's access consciousness. And there's other ones, but the if you presume that there is phenomenal consciousness, then you can see all of these other things that are called consciousness as a certain type of processing of that phenomenal consciousness. But I think it's critical to keep in mind that you don't have to presume that phenomenal consciousness is there for these other things to be present. So they really don't address the hard problem. So for example, you can build a droid, a robot, a computer program that shows all the evidence in terms of input and output of agency. The person or the thing can talk about having feelings. It can talk about coming up with creative ideas. It can say, I feel like I am something. And, what's the proof that there really is an experience there? And it's, Alan Turing came up with in terms of originally referring to intelligence of this concept of a Turing test. If you could pass all sort of, and the idea was like, if whatever it is that's purporting to have intelligence, if you can give it all of these tests, scenarios, and that it can run through, and if it can convince all observers, that if the observers cannot falsify the idea that it is intelligent, then it is by definition intelligent. And so, basically it's referring to it's ultimately judged by the inputs and outputs. And you could presume the same thing about consciousness, but it doesn't ultimately answer this question about consciousness, because again, you could, if we can assume, and we don't really know, that the computer programs don't have an inner experience. You can program a computer, the computer to exhibit all of these things. And if you can't do it right now, it definitely will. We're going to figure out. And if you don't think a computer's sense of agency, like speaking or producing textual output that is if you don't think it's convincing, if it looks like it's having a sense of agency now, we're going to be there like very, very, very quickly. And there's some really compelling examples right now. So, all of those problems, besides the phenomenal consciousness, you can see those as all squarely within the domain of psychology and neuroscience, because it really doesn't matter whether there's an inner experience. Like, okay, how does the brain create, how is the brain behaving in such a way that this organism is acting like it has a sense of self? And it's not really whether it has a sense of self. How is it operating such that the organism is acting like it has a sense of self? And you could argue that having a sense of self, or acting rather like you have a sense of self, was an evolutionary advantage. And so that was an adapted system. And, what are the, similar questions about like, what are the rules and how should an organism, pull things out of memory when needed, in referring to access consciousness. So that's kind of, I think going forward, this idea that like psychedelics would be really important for understanding consciousness, we just have to really, okay, like what? Which one of these terms, in reference to consciousness are we talking about, and how? Right. And I think there's a lot of promise. Now, I think that the understanding the nature of phenomenal consciousness, the hard problem, we still don't have any, I'm very open, as I stated in that paper, but it's called the hard problem for a reason. Like right now, I couldn't lay out an experiment with loading people up with as many psychedelics as possible with the craziest, load them up with 5-methoxy-DMT, under any conditions. I can't think of any experiment that could ultimately prove that there is phenomenal consciousness to an observer, and that will, tell us why or how there is phenomenal consciousness. But who knows?
Right.
Maybe. But these other ones, like self-awareness, I think there's a lot of opportunity there with psychedelics.
I always think about, I guess, like technology too. Like, do we have the technology to even, or do we understand consciousness enough to like build technology to measure it? And I guess even if we did, would we know what we're looking at times? And then I also am curious about like how consciousness also can get tied up with like spirit and soul. Are we talking about that at times? Like, for example, like I had a near-death experience, and I use the word consciousness, but there's also this other part of me that felt it was something else. And I never really know how to talk about it. Is it consciousness? Is it soul? Is it spirit? Is it this? Is it that? Like, is it just experience? Like who's experiencing that experience, right?
Mm-hmm. And it becomes harder to define these concepts when we're outside of the realm of empirical observation or empirical science. And I think it's important. Like, we're all human beings, and I think it's absurd to say that we can assume that nothing exists that's outside of the realm of what's empirically observable by first principles. I mean, I don't know. If you think about, like, does love exist? It's like, I mean, maybe our definition of what that is incomplete, but I think love exists. Does beauty exist? I think beauty exists. I experience these things tremendously. And so, I think it's important when we get into these realms about, anomalous experiences that we both keep an open mind about people's stories and a humility that we don't really know what's going on. But at the same time, we have to be humble in terms of not dismissing what might be going on there, but also be humble to know that we really don't know. We can't fool ourselves into thinking that we're sure, at least about what the nature, if something's going on. I mean, maybe at the personal level, we're convinced something's going on, but we don't know what that is. And we get into realms where it's like, you just got to be like, everything you attach to it. I mean, when you're already into the unknown like that, every word that, it starts to color how we start to think of that thing. Like, do you say consciousness? Do you say spirit, soul? These all have like crazy different connotations, and like that all has a coloring that we should just be aware of. Yeah. And recognize that we have stepped outside of the realm of science, and it's fine. Like, I can say I think a piece of art is beautiful, and I think it's just important to be aware of that. I can't prove that scientifically. It's fine. I could still say it looks beautiful. But that I cannot speak to that scientifically. I think that's an important distinction. And psychedelics put us in this, they put us squarely in this fuzzy area, which is what makes them, one of the things that makes them so fascinating. And people could come about them from just kind of wildly different perspectives.
Yeah. And you talk about like psychedelics maybe helping out with this easy problem of consciousness. And you kind of raise this point here about, the default mode network. And I wonder like what your take is on understanding the psychedelic effect with the default mode network, and, how that has played into understanding the experience and consciousness from that neuroscience perspective, and what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think there might be something going on there. I think the biggest take home is that the research is so early, and there's already certain things to just be really aware of. And a narrative has sort of started that, one, that the default mode network is the ego, and that it's just such a beautiful narrative that seems to make, intuitive sense. Like, like people having these sort of, mystical experiences where they feel like they're one with everything, or they're reporting ego death or ego loss. The default mode network is decoupled, and the default mode network is the ego. Like, there's your story. And that's the fundamental way in which psychedelics work. I think that's, even starting from like, okay, it's important to know that the idea that the default mode network is related to self-referential processing. That wasn't new with psychedelics. So psychedelics didn't contribute to that understanding. And we're getting into, even there before the psychedelics, we're getting into really difficult terrain. Some neuroscientists will just like, they just get completely flabbergasted at this idea of calling it the ego, that, they're like, no, we know that its activity is more synchronized when you have certain tasks that at play, like, so thinking about yourself in the future or remembering something personal in the past is like, okay, that's even self-referential processing for some people is going too far. And it's just in the history of neuroscience, there's just this long history of, I don't know, you see some area has a role in something and you're like, aha, we found the center for this. And it's like, in so many cases, I mean, just like a failure to understand a systems level analysis of like, yeah, there's a whole lot that's involved with a whole lot. It's like saying like serotonin is the mood drug. And it's like all these like really, so whether we're talking about a neurotransmitter or we're talking about a brain area, or now at another level, talking about a brain network, which really just refers to this pattern of synchronization or lack of synchronization across different areas. It's really easy to see it's correlation with something and then say, it's responsible for that. So anyway, there's some caveats there even before we get to psychedelics. And so again, getting to psychedelics. So now we know that that's one of the local area networks that seems to be altered by acute administration of psychedelics, but it's not the only one. And it's not even necessarily the most powerful one. So, to what degree have we latched on to a story prematurely? I think it's fair to say that one of the things I think it's been important that there seem to be profound changes in brain network dynamics, both when psychedelics are on board. In other words, when someone's actually experiencing a psychedelic, that both in terms of increase in global network activity, so areas that don't normally communicate so much now presumably communicating. And I say presumably because what we're really seeing is synchronization, and that presumably means more or less communication. So more synchronization, more communication. And then we have local networks, and default mode network is one that normally are more synchronized, that are less synchronized. So yeah, so I think there's a whole lot of promise there, and it may very well be that like something with the default mode network is a key, or one of the keys that explains quintessential psychedelic effects. Although it's also possible that it explains that it's not so special, that explains maybe some of the effects sometimes, and that these aren't so quintessentially psychedelic. In other words, so one of the pieces of evidence for that is that we have a growing, a list of research findings that suggest that other drugs like amphetamine and THC and recently salvinorin A, and now some of these you could call like more broadly or psychedelic, like cannabis or salvinorin A, but amphetamine, and I think alcohol. So that those show a decoupling of the default mode network. So maybe it's more the decoupling of the default mode network is just like, maybe it's more about like just not feeling like yourself.
Right.
Which like when you're like super drunk, you also don't feel like your normal self.
True.
when you're, and when you're, kind of loaded on speed, you also don't quite feel like your normal self. So maybe it's a signature of something that's, interesting, but not quite so interesting when we're, talking about claims about what is sort of the like maybe it's not the Rosetta Stone of really understanding the quintessential psychedelic mechanism in the brain, but it might be. Just like the main point is that we're really early, and there are some of these caveats that people should be aware of about these effects of, for example, other drugs, and the effects of these psychedelics on other aspects of brain network function.
So we did a good take there on consciousness. I'm curious if we can maybe jump into kind of more the social or interpersonal problems that might come up when somebody's like talking about consciousness in a certain way. And like say like an ayahuasca circle in Baltimore, like you're kind of used to like kind of a rough city, and then you start going to these things and people start talking about consciousness and different kinds of spirits and like talking to plants and all this kind of wild stuff that wasn't part of your purview before. And how do you, as a community or an individual going into that community, kind of safeguard to say like, this stuff might not be accurate. Like this looks a little bit more like, religious thinking than perhaps kind of a critical thinking of what's happening here. Like I think your article kind of covered that as well, right?
Yeah. So it's focused. It's very similar. It's focused on how we should be acting as clinicians and scientists. And so I'm not really telling the people that are showing up to a local, group in Baltimore interested in psychedelics how they should be thinking about things any more than I'm telling people at the local Baptist church how they should be thinking about things, or, showing up to, a Native American church peyote ceremony and telling them how they should be thinking about things.
Right.
Now, someone might certainly, if they choose to, extrapolate this to those, to those areas. But I certainly don't want to. Yeah, I sort of I see a kind of a boundary in terms of where my recommendation should strongly fall. Yeah, so my basic take, and again, it's one that, like the consciousness stuff, that it can easily be mischaracterized. So what I'm not saying is, I'm not saying people should be cold, and I'm not saying that we should be interpersonally neutral. And I'm not saying that we should be conveying to patients and participants that a materialist philosophy, and not even saying that we should be conveying an agnostic, viewpoint on any of these things about any metaphysical question about religious and the supernatural things that people call spirituality. I'm just saying that it is a domain that we should recognize that where we should let the participant operate from their own belief systems, if any, and draw their own conclusions about these metaphysical questions, if any, and that we should not be introducing anything. So it's just like it's not on us to provide any answers on these questions or introduce frameworks that aren't in the realm of empirical science and solid clinical wisdom. That doesn't mean that if someone comes in and they're a Christian and part of their experience was Jesus speaking to their heart, that doesn't mean we should say no, Jesus doesn't exist. It's like nor should we say, someone with the shamanistic framework that they feel like they're visited by plant spirits, that the spirit of the mushroom, we shouldn't be telling them that didn't happen, but we also shouldn't be introducing these things, and the same way.
So let me do a quick spin on this, because this is really interesting. The way we introduce this in breathwork, because we're in kind of the Groff lineage, we'll say that there's many strange things that happen. Like you could have the experience of becoming an eagle, Ganesh, Shiva, Jesus, whatever. There's a lot of possible experiences, like anything you can imagine could come up for you. Mm-hmm. And we're not necessarily here to help you understand what that means, like philosophically, but we'll help you kind of deal with the experience of whatever it is that comes up. So we're introducing that things that are spooky and metaphysical might happen. Like, for instance, past life experiences happen pretty regularly, but how do we prep somebody ahead of time to say, this might happen? We're not necessarily going to help you understand, like, say, oh, this is because the spirit works this way when reincarnation happens. It's like, I'm not there. I'm not going to be saying anything like that to people. But I think you get where I'm going with this. Like
right.
I want to prep them. It's kind of like an informed consent, but I don't want to give them metaphysical baggage that goes along with it. Right. And I think, your example is one where it's the same basic point, that you're, this kind of treading lightly. Now, we might, in fact, differ on where you can go for that same basic principle and differ on where you land at. So, for example, in terms of the nuances, like I would not, in preparing a participant for a psychedelic session, kind of introduce them to past lives as something that might come up
but we are going to get into a gray area where these are good questions to deal with. Now, yes, there have been people that have reported past life stuff, but it's definitely not in the hundreds of psychedelic sessions I've seen. It's not typical, and it is infrequent enough such that I think that it's sort of not a pop out effect for me. And I don't even think it's not in the category of something that occurs so frequently that I feel like, and that people are frankly disturbed by if they have it, that I feel like I'm not being, I wouldn't feel that
that's probably the better point. Like, it's not that alarming when people have the experience. You can deal with it pretty neatly later.
Right. And frankly, any of the kind of cool stuff, the interesting, the mystical stuff, the interesting stuff is not, it's more, none of that. No one has complained like, oh my God, you guys didn't really warn me enough that I'd had this sense of feeling one with the universe. And like, I'm going to talk to your IRB about this, that you're not doing a good job. It's the dark side that, is kind of the problem. And so, we might, I might, as I said, I would, and again, I realize we could be applying the same basic principle and land at different places, but I wouldn't be introducing to people on the front end the possibility that they could have past life experiences, in part because I think simply by introducing that, I might make that experience more likely. And then you're not even sure. It's like, okay, did they have it because of my introduction? Now, if someone says, as has happened occasionally, someone says that they feel like they had an experience that might have been a past life. And, I don't, it's like anything else. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Could you tell me more about that? What do you think that means? It's like you do this reflective listening, you encourage them to process it more, and you try to tread that line of like, I'm not filling in metaphysical answers for you, and I'm not here to judge you, whatever, your belief system is. And just, I think the main key with like integrating these sessions, it's just processing. It's like them to, and you can keep your clinical radar up. It's like, yeah, there's a difference if someone says Jesus spoke to their heart versus Jesus spoke through the neighbor's dog to tell them to kill someone. Like I think that was a Son of Sam, murders. Like, it's like extreme obvious example, or you get into schizotypal territory where someone says, gosh, every day, I turn on the radio and it's always a message, talking to me. And it's like, yeah, your clinical radar starts to go up, but just, the mention of plant spirits or these things, or Jesus or Buddha or any, or past lives, it's like, it doesn't raise that clinical radar, necessarily. Now, I will say something that did come up was, another team member, when talking to one of the participants afterwards, and this was in my smoking cessation research, brought up the concept of Kundalini, and she wasn't familiar with it, and became rather obsessed with Kundalini and read books, and even in finding information suggesting like, oh, you can die from a Kundalini experience. And you guys talk about analyzing mystical experience. I didn't have a regular mystical experience like those other participants. I had a Kundalini experience, and that's, you guys don't know what you're dealing with. And, this is something that can kill you. And, and I was frankly very, I was, how do I put it? I did not like the fact that, another team member on a study that I was in charge of introduced this as an explanatory framework after the fact. Now, if the participant had said, oh, I've read about Kundalini, what do you think about that? They're bringing it up, and, say like, I don't have expertise in Kundalini. I've read about it. And so that energy you felt through your body, that sounds, I could see where you would, you might think about that lens or whatever, just basically reflecting the same thing back to letting them know like, okay, yeah, I get you. I know what that concept is. And I hear what you're saying. I, not really weighing in with, you're not there to tell them they're wrong. You're not there to tell them they're right. And frankly, something that like, I don't know, some people, came at me with a bunch of questions when I put on Twitter, when I posted about this, this aspect of the article, it's like as if some people out there are assuming that patients and participants are constantly coming to their guides in these studies to provide these metaphysical answers. It's like, oh my God, no one, like, thankfully they're not like, no one's
I think because
like,
it's
Matt,
clinical, you have a nice level of protection, right? Like in the
and
like you're not pretending to be the yoga or Kundalini guru, right? Like you're there in a clinical capacity.
right. And it might be because I give them this heads up ahead of time that like, hey, in terms of the nature of these experiences, it's like, that's on you. And we're here to support you no matter what. And it doesn't matter, and maybe it's all a bunch of hooey and it's just a useful experience. Like it doesn't matter, I mean, I think the heart is like you care for this person. It's that level of caring that I think all clinicians should have for their patients or participants in research studies. Like, I care for your well-being. I want this process to be useful for you. I'm here. I'm keeping you safe. We're in a cocoon, man, and we're a team. But you're, in terms of metaphysical, what direction you go in, like you're in the driver's seat, and you don't have to go anywhere with it, or you can go anywhere you want. But I care for you as a person in my appropriate role with the right boundaries as a clinician or scientist. And yeah, I'm keeping you safe. And I tell you, I've just seen enough to know, like, I think that's the formula. And one doesn't have to weigh in and say, oh, you've had this type of experience with darkness in your chest. Oh, that's some type of sorcerer's spell that has been cast on you, that, and this is something, and not to joke, this is something that a shaman might say. And I'm not telling them that that's not the case, but I don't know that to be the case. And it's not a framework that we can say with any confidence from a scientific clinical background that I can lend any weight at all for that, being the case. So, like it is different, but I've seen enough to suggest that it works. Like you don't have to pretend like you have the answers. And I don't know, frankly, I think we'd all be better off if we just, I don't know. It's like if I don't know, physicians had more humility in terms of like, forget the metaphysics, just
I'll
about
always
like,
agree to that.
Yeah, there's a whole lot about the human body we don't know, like I think that would be like, and just at so many levels, just like being like an intellectual honesty of, now I also realize part of treatment is having like the faith and the confidence and being in someone's care, but that gets nuanced. I think my gut tells me the important part of that is the caring, and that you do have expertise in something. It doesn't have to be about the metaphysical system, beliefs. And a physician doesn't have to pretend they know everything about the human body, but they, going through med school does, a lot,
absolutely.
And so just having some level of expertise, like, and having that caring and having that the right clinical environment, like that's enough. Like you don't have to extend yourself beyond those boundaries for that sort of, that effect to take place, where, just trusting a clinician, that sort of,
it's a great point.
That sort of effect.
Like you don't necessarily need the 20-year internship in the jungle or spend a lot of time at Osho's ashram in India or whatever. Like you can probably do this in the US purely, or like in your country.
Right. And I keep peppering in these caveats that, like, for someone in a religious tradition that calls for them spending 20 years in the ashram and, and going down to it's like, I'm not saying anything about that. Like that's fine. Like that's
personally not my speed, but I'm glad some people are doing it. Right. Like I kind of like that there's a lot of weird stuff happening, but I also have problems with it. Like I want people to experiment and cult out and niche down so they can come back and share their results with us. Like
right.
Osho was a good and bad thing.
The outliers are useful. These are data points. You don't have to spend 20 years meditating in a cave if you can actually, well, it's like, this is like basically the story of the human being and our ability to observationally learn. Like you can learn, like we're better at, like, some other animals can do it a little bit, but not like us. Like you can look at the other primate touching the hot surface and like being in a lot of pain and realize, like, I'm not going to do that, or, having some reward and following suit. So we can look at the people that have meditated for years and say, maybe that's for me. Yeah, or maybe not, let me look at a number of examples. But yeah, like, and just personally, I haven't seen anybody that's sold everything they've owned and gone to meditated in a cave after their psychedelic experiences. And I'm not even necessarily saying that would be a wrong thing for a particular individual, but this stuff can be way more mainstream. And that's another part of it, is like way more mainstream. And we can we can frame it as being more mainstream than I think it's giving off a new age vibe that is fine, with the Buddhas in the room and with the other, kind of religious type trappings. It's some people are fine with that. Other people will, and I think we kind of kid ourselves about the bubble that we live in, both in academia and even being people that are interested in psychedelics in academia that like I grew up in a more traditional religious framework. I have plenty of I have roots in Appalachia and like just, I come from hillbillies and like I have plenty of aunts and uncles that have, died of, serious illness that maybe could have been they could have had could have really benefited from the type of work we did with cancer patients. And they wouldn't have signed up for a study with a Buddha statue because that's not their religion. Like they're Bible believing Christians, and whether you agree or not, they would think that's a false god or what have you, or just weird enough. It just sends a signal that's not for them. And I see that as incredibly arbitrary, especially with the caveat that like we invite the participants, the clients, to bring whatever they want. And that could absolutely be the Buddha. It could be the, prayer flags. It could be shamanistic stuff. It could be the flying spaghetti monster. Like,
I love that you put that on that article there as the picture on that page.
Right. And I hope no one was insulted by that, but I do, one of we got to think about this. It's like, whether we're talking about a Richard Dawkins style, kind of hard atheist who might be inclined to be of the spaghetti monster variety, appreciating person, or whether it be like the Muslim, like, do we want a statue of a Buddha to tell either of those people that this is not for you if they're incredibly suffering from end of life anxiety, if they're suffering from a decades long addiction, if they're depressed and are at risk of suicide, or I don't know. It just seems like we really need to think like, how is this going to play out in the world? And how are we really going to help people? Or do we really want someone to think, oh no, I don't know, like this stuff is for hippies or new age folks. Like, they might be a political conservative. They might be a veteran. They might be any of these, someone who would never touch an illicit drug in their life. And do we want those types of people saying, oh, this is not for me? And I just see these as human experiences.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about just the narrative around psychedelics. And I wonder, talking about making it more accessible to folks that may not want to reach out for an experience like that because it has these narratives. So how do you approach that? And how are you thinking about changing that narrative to make it more accessible for people that might think, oh, this is just some hippy dippy thing. And, you're talking about spirits and consciousness and energies and auras. That's not for me.
Well, I can only sort of change the stuff that's within my, control. So, even with, great colleagues, not everyone shares my view. And so for studies that I'm principal investigator on, like the smoking cessation research and like the upcoming opioid addiction and PTSD work that we'll be doing for psilocybin, and also some work using LSD to treat chronic pain. On those studies, no, there's just not going to be a Buddha in the room unless a participant at the invitation to bring in any meaningful objects they like, unless they choose to bring it in. And, sort of this orientation of not providing metaphysical answers. I mean, it's what I've been doing all along in terms of when I introduce participants and prepare them, I basically give them a short spiel on that. It's like, hey, people report, and they've probably, come across any number of these things, you name it. People have talked about it with psychedelics, and, be it religious or not, or about God or not, or you name it, different dimensions, like whatever framework, I can't speak to that. If you have an experience, then you're the world's expert on what that experience ultimately means at those levels for you. But we're about being a team and keeping you at the center, and you make that meaning yourself if there's any meaning to be made, but we're keeping you safe and we're helping you achieve this goal, and just providing a safety net and a team to help you explore, beyond whatever. If it's about quitting smoking, it's like, hey, this is, anytime you give a high dose of a psychedelic, we're very clear, like this is a deep psychological exploration, and don't be surprised what might come up. So regardless, we are here to support you to make the most out of this process. So just, providing that type of framework, I think that's where it's at. Like, and it's all the stuff that, when we use the word spirituality, which is that can mean so many different things, like consciousness.
Yeah, it's a tough word.
And there's the stuff that, is it's supernatural for some people. It's angels and crystals with special powers. And for other people, and another use of the word is just all of the stuff that even like Richard Dawkins would say, like, yeah, this is good for a human being, like, and any, empirical, psychologist would say, it's like, being connected to those around you, having love for those close to you, feeling like you're part of a community, whether it's like your family, all of humanity across the planet, feeling that there's something special to that, a sense of that there's meaning in life, no matter what the source of it, whether it's like there's meaning to be found or that you're just making meaning. There's nothing there that Dawkins, as our example, would disagree with. Like, this makes for a better human being that appreciates, and looks for meaning in life, truth and beauty, and like completely secular. You don't have to go. You can go farther, and like in psychedelic experiences, you can go much farther. People, I'm not sure whether farther might be the wrong word, but you can include all of those other things that are supernatural, but it doesn't have to. And I think I recently read it's a preprint of his book, so I don't think it's out yet, but Chris Letheby, who's a philosopher who studies psychedelics, and he lays this framework out very well in his book about this really secular portion of what we call spirituality being kind of the key in these sessions. And, it can come with or without those other things. And it works well with all those other things, but those are just, you don't need those things. And a lot of people don't have those things.
With all the research that, you guys have done at Johns Hopkins, have you ever come across like a situation with a participant that having some sort of metaphysical framework, like say like a shamanic framework, could have been helpful? Like, have you seen any like really challenging experiences or experiences that came up where you're like, maybe having somebody with that background could have been helpful for navigating through that?
Not really. And that's not to say that, people haven't had difficult, challenging experiences. And of course there's a counterfactual that, I'm dealing with here. It's like, would it have been better had someone had that framework? I'm not convinced that there would have been. My best guess is that, I don't know, like I could imagine in some sense that maybe some people might feel better in the short term. And this is purely speculative, but better in the short term to have some speculation. But then you also have the consequence of, like, you're leading them into a territory that you just don't have there could be some long-term pitfalls. And it raises ethical questions like, is it right to send them into that direction? Because we don't really know if that's true or not. And a lot of these things, like when you push them to a religious, and I'm not here to tell people to do, like, people out there, I'm more speaking to the clinicians and scientists, but regular folks, I'm not telling people that they shouldn't be religious or, what their metaphysical beliefs are. But when it is the fact that any of these domains, like, there are probably, because they touch on such deep issues, like they are prone to power abuses. So you name the religion and there's going to be people that have engaged in horrendous power abuses. I mean, whenever you're the conduit for like the divine or what have you, like that comes with some, you get into some dicey territory where humans abuse power, and not everyone does, but it's certainly a potential. So you name the religion, there are those abuses. So, like, is it your job as a clinician to push, to even nudge someone into one of those frameworks? I don't think it's our job to tell them to stay away, but I don't know. I wouldn't feel comfortable pushing someone or nudging them into any sort of belief system. And I've had, like, I gave a talk at oh gosh, where was this? It was in Utah, and psychiatry department. So a really sharp psychiatrist. And he kind of surprised me. Like, we were having dinner the night before I was giving a talk there, and he was like, man, that's how this stuff should work. Like, I want the shaman who's I don't care if it's true or not. He's like, I want the shaman that says, like, this is the deal. Like, this is and who cares whether it's true or not, you know? And he was taking this hard case of, you know, hey, like, we need some belief system to wrap ourselves around. And yeah, I mean, I disagreed with him, but I get that. I mean, there's an interesting point to be made there. And I still feel that we're at a place in, you know, as a, I don't know, at least in clinical practice and from empirically informed clinical practice, that we're best to let people, if there's something to that, then people can find their own way.
Right.
With that. And that, yeah, I mean,
I lean towards that. You know, I find the spiritual stuff a little sticky, and I think you're going to get better results if you have less there and allow for people to do some self-discovery and exploration after. Like, we definitely raised this topic in our class, both of our classes yesterday. And it was interesting to get some pushback from some of our students on it. And they're kind of using platitudes of, like, you know, people get, you know, people, the right people will find you. I'm like, is that really a good enough excuse to have a Buddha statue in the room? Like, I don't know. Feels goofy.
Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, this is my personal life experiences come into play. I mean, I don't know. Like, I personally just, and again, this is not me as a scientist, you know, this is me as a person, but I sort of figure out, like, long ago that, like, you know, give up on finding any sort of, like, individual that, I don't know. There are no gurus. Like, I've never met a perfect person, and or anything close, frankly.
Like, we can use the same consciousness angle for what is enlightenment. Like, that's a crazy topic. And
right.
Like, I've met some people who allege to be enlightened. It just means they're a little different.
The first sign that they're not enlightened is to make that claim.
Like, yeah. Perhaps. And, you know, I don't buy any of it, right? Like, I just say we're all humans.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a complete, I mean, there's a truth that's so profound that anyone should agree, I think should agree with, you know, like, we're all humans, we're all, and I don't know, my take in life is, like, look, you know, we're faced with all kinds of examples, like, your best, I mean, even, like, in terms of academic mentorship, I can look at any number of mentors and say, like, oh yeah, they were really good at this, but they really sucked at that. You know, like, it's like a menu. I'm going to have a little bit of that. I'm going to take my big picture thinking from my graduate mentor. I'm going to take my, you know, like, you know, detail and writing from my postdoctoral mentor. I'm going to take my, you know, sort of, you know, this aspect of my philosophy of science from a mentor from undergrad. You know, you have a menu, and it's like, same way just generally in life. And I don't know, like, again, I'm not here to tell people not to engage in any particular religion, but for me personally, that's how I go about, you know, things. It's like, we're kind of in this postmodern, I mean, it's great in a sense. Like, we have, unlike almost all of history, if you're interested in these things, if you're interested in any metaphysical system, man, get on the internet. Like, and just like, you got a million at your fingertips that in all of the history of humanity, it's like, you had one thing that you were born into. Like, and even, like, not buying into that wasn't really it was kind of privately, but it might get your head chopped off if you were public about it. But, like, we have so much freedom that you can, you know, you can make decisions. And again, I'm not telling anyone not to, what religion it should or should not engage in. But for me personally, just at a certain level, I think I personally find that, like, going after this sense of enlightenment or, you know, finding some guru is just, I don't know. For me, it seems like very, like, 1990s for me in terms of in other words, in your 20s, something you go through, like, you know, this type of thinking.
Yeah, it was definitely reminding me. I was actually just talking about this other day on some webinar I recorded. Somebody was asking me about healing, and I was just talking about the healing journey I took after my near-death experience, because I feel like I needed some sort of framework. And I dabbled in all sorts of different things. I did my undergrad in transpersonal psychology and experimented with all different sorts of healing modalities. And the thing that I was saying to this person was like, I felt like I was seeking these experts and projecting like that onto them and really kind of giving my power away into that person because I thought that they were going to quote unquote heal me or show me the thing. And I ultimately came back to, I think this is why I got so interested in breath work, was because it was me in a room with a group of people and, pretty non-directive. Maybe you get some of that Groffian perinatal birth matrices that you take on and think about that in a framework. But, it was just like me and my breath. And it had me kind of like view my own sense of agency of my own experience. And that's what I think has been the most important thing for me. It's like, how do we develop our own sense of agency with these experiences? And so I appreciate you kind of highlighting all this stuff. It sounds like kind of like our background too, and how we facilitate breath work.
Yeah. And I could, and by the way, I'm hoping to do I actually have an approved protocol by the IRB to do some Groff style breath work research, but breath work is the most COVID unfriendly manipulation you can possibly do. So it's on hold for a while, but I have a great interest in it. And
I connected with somebody on your team about that a few months or maybe last year. I forget who it was.
So hopefully, it's, and I think there's clearly a number of places of overlap with psychedelics and breath work that are interesting. But what you just described is like one of the important ones. I think one of the reasons why psychedelics and probably breath work can be so effective is that people are doing their own heavy lifting. No one comes out of it and says, "Oh, but that." Well, maybe I try to avoid absolutes as a scientist, but it's not very frequent where someone comes in and they completely give over, and I guess, when you have sort of like there surely are, violations of what I'm saying when people are, sort of getting into that guru mode, around them. But at least in the type of work that that like clinical research with psychedelics, like people come out feeling they have done, rightfully so, they have done the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, I took some pill and thanks to Pfizer, like who was able to figure out a way to manipulate my serotonin system, I'm feeling better. Or thanks to, doc so-and-so who knew that I needed Lexapro rather than Prozac, like it's like, no, like you faced your own demons, dude. Like you did the hard work. You cried your heart out about that thing you did you don't feel good about. And you came out with a laundry list of what you need to fix with your life and with this, renewed sense because you feel like you've earned it. Like there's this sense of like, it's not, and that's what so many people that don't know psychedelics at all, like they kind of misconstrue this. It's like, people are, give it to cancer patients. You're going to just bliss them out the rest of their life and make it easy for. It's like, oh my gosh, they only knew the heavy lifting people do with psychedelic experiences and like breath work too. And I think it's, not as, nothing's quite as powerful and sort of like it's happening whether you like it or not, like psychedelics, but breath work, when people really lean into it and they have an experience, it's of the same nature. Like that was happening in their body. And it was them who like really pushed their breath, even when there were some signals in their body saying, whoa, like just chill out, just breathe normal. This is feeling weird. We shouldn't be doing it. Like, no, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do this. I'm going to hit it hard. And, there's this sense of ownership, like, they earned it. Like they chose to go into this and they had to deal with, this, whatever came up and sort of like, or, they kind of push the pedal to the metal in terms of the breath work, or at least with the psychedelics, it's more of like, and I'm stealing this from Terrence McKenna, like all these other methods are like, you're trying to push the accelerator for years to make something happen. But with psychedelics at the right dose, it's like you're on a fully loaded semi truck barreling down a mountain and you're tasked with not slamming on the brakes. So at least, they were able to get through it and not completely slam on the brakes, even if they tapped them every once in a while.
Good old Terry. Cool. Well, I see that we're a little over an hour. So I wonder if we want to wrap up, if there's any updates that you want to give to our listeners about the new center at Johns Hopkins, Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness, and maybe what you guys are up to over there.
Sure. So we're still conducting our research, helping people quit smoking. And I should say before all of this that the current studies, you can find out and apply for all of them at www.hopkinspsychedelic.org. So, and as we get new studies up and running, they're going to be there. So that's always the best go-to to look into what studies we have available. And I'll say for psychedelics research in general, beyond, just for anyone in the country and even internationally, clinicaltrials.gov is a great go-to site if you type in psilocybin. So in terms of the work we're at Hopkins, we're ongoing with the smoking cessation. We have also ongoing studies with anorexia, and this is all psilocybin, treating anorexia and treating early stage Alzheimer's disease, primarily treating the mood issues with that, but also looking at potential effects on cognitive decline. And then a whole lot of things that are either at the IRB or the review board at the university or the FDA or DEA, waiting for all those approvals to come in. But so in my court I'm leading the work where we're going to be using psilocybin to help treat opioid addiction, and also works using psilocybin to treat PTSD. And those are both randomized clinical trials. And my colleague Fred Barrett's going to be leading study treating co-morbid alcoholism with depression. So that's going to be exciting because comorbidity is important. A whole lot of people have more than one issue. And there's some interesting theoretical questions about the overlap. Like, why is this stuff working for depression and addictions? It's probably those common elements that are being hit between these nominally distinct disorders. And then I mentioned the Alzheimer's work that my colleague Al Garcia Romeo is leading, but he's also going to be leading work looking at using psilocybin to treat post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, which has previously been called chronic Lyme disease syndrome.
Great.
Yeah, and it seems like there's really something to this. It's still very mysterious, but to that disorder, and you can imagine a lot of people have gone to docs and have been dismissed as it's all hypochondriasis and that type of thing. And they've really it's understandable that like a lot of medical issues, they've really been run through the ringer. So that's part of the rationale in treating primarily mood associated with that. And I think I mentioned the anorexia work, and I have I have a grant also outside of the nominal center, but a grant from Hefter Research Institute using LSD to treat chronic pain, to try to help people come off of their opioids and their opioid medications that have been prescribed. And so that's an update. And again, check out our website if you're interested in applying for some of those studies and seeing what's involved with them.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Matthew Johnson. This has been really great, and just really appreciate your time here.
You're welcome. It's been a fun discussion, and thanks for inviting me. This has been cool.
And there you have it, Matt Johnson of Johns Hopkins. Matt is amazing. Matt's going to be around for a while in this psychedelic space, and I'm just really excited for him to be involved and to see what he's able to pull off over at Hopkins and with all the other interesting ventures going on. There's so much happening in the psychedelic space. It's really, I dare to say, impossible to keep up with it unless you're doing like 70 hours a week of just reading. So I think that's a good thing, right? So we can niche out, develop ideas and theories with evidence and all these different sub aspects of the space. There's a lot left to do. Again, we're many decades behind where we should be right now regarding our knowledge of how psychedelics interact with the human organism. So a lot left to do. So I think that's it about the podcast. Again, thanks, Matt. I hope we can do it again. It was super fun. And so if you want to get some psychedelic education, come learn about navigating psychedelics. our amazing class, Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists is the full title. You can learn more about it at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And it's an amazing 8-week program. It's a foundations program, so you can kind of get a idea of what's going on in the space and figure out where you might want to go. So there's a lot of options, a lot of places to go, a lot of ways to move in this field, and we try to help you figure all that out. And what else do we have going on? A lot of events. So stay tuned on our social and our email. There's going to be a lot of really fun stuff happening over the next couple months. So yeah, possibly even Bicycle Day. But, and that's it for now. So this is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. We will see you on Friday. Bye-bye.